All right. Welcome everyone. It is obviously bedtime, and I'm obvious. Obviously. Glad to have you here. I was not quite done with everything when I started the countdown. I had to do some troubleshooting on the Sisyphus. It was making an awful clacking noise, and the app was telling me that there was a mechanical failure just before I had to start the stream, and I was a little panicked. Thought for sure it was going to be broken for the stream. I don't know. I'm going to have to talk to the company because I seem to be having an awful lot of problems with this thing. None permanent so far, though, thankfully. In any case, I'm very glad all of you are here. I hope everyone's having an okay, I think most of you are having a holiday break right now. Is that right? No, I will try not to break the Sisyphus, but most of you are on a holiday break, right? The vast majority of people who watch the stream are in the United States, so if you want to go ahead and vote on the poll, I'll restart it at intermission, or you can wait anytime before then. We'll see how close we get. And if you remember, John had just been arrested for the murder, and we'll see if he turns out to be guilty or not, or if it was somebody else. Now it'll be the decision about what to read after this. If we go with another mystery, another Agatha Christie, or something else. No, John was arrested. We are going to start with the opening of the trial for John Cavendish. I'm also thinking that the Conan stream, I'm going to change the time slot for that one. If you have any thoughts about, hey Logie Bear, glad you're here. If you have any thoughts about when would be a good time for that stream, I'll keep it on Tuesday, but put it at a different time of day. The time slot was an experiment, and it just doesn't seem to be working out too terribly well. So, feedback in the Discord, by the way, please join the Discord. Gives you a chance to play some games with us. I'll be opening a Minecraft server in the next couple of days that we can all play on together. And we'll play some Among Us and things like that. The feedback channel on the Discord gives you a chance to let me know what's going right, what's going wrong with the stream, ideas, requests for other time slots to be added, other things to stream. You can go to the book request channel and request me to read specific books. I'll be opening the Patreon shortly as well, and I'll be adding a tier in there for private readings in the Discord for subscribers that are more modern books. So it won't just be the public domain books anymore after that. Although those sessions will not be recorded in order to comply with copyright laws. So it'll be be there or miss it. So, yeah. In any case, the Discord command isn't working. Let me check that really quick. Not sure why it wouldn't be. How about that? Okay, try the Discord command again real quick, if you don't mind. I am not the third imposter. But, Vela, if you try the Discord command really quick, it should work now. I'm not feeling guilty. Hey, look at that. It works now. Awesome. It was just not enabled. My apologies. And there, I reopened the poll for you. All right. Well, vote on the poll if you think you know, or if you want to wait a few minutes, few pages, and we will restart the poll completely at the intermission and see where we're at with that. Discord link is in the chat. Please do join us there. We can talk about what book to read next, what you thought of this one, as well as any of the other stories that we're reading. And yeah, so without further ado, I suppose we'll get into Chapter 11, The Case for the Prosecution. The trial of John Cavendish for the murder of his stepmother took place 2 months later. Of the intervening weeks, I will say little, but my admiration and sympathy went out unfeignedly to Mary Cavendish. She ranged herself passionately on her husband's side, scorning the mere idea of his guilt, and fought for him tooth and nail. I expressed my admiration to Perrault, and he nodded thoughtfully. Yes, she is of those women who show at their best in adversity. It brings out all that is sweetest and truest in them. Her pride and her jealousy have... Jealousy? I queried. Yes. Have you not realized that she is an unusually jealous woman? As I was saying, her pride and jealousy have been laid aside. She thinks of nothing but her husband and the terrible fate that is hanging over him. He spoke very earnestly, or very feelingly, and I looked at him earnestly, remembering that last afternoon when he had been deliberating whether or not to speak. With his tenderness for a woman's happiness, I felt glad that the decision had been taken out of his hands. Even now, I said, I can hardly believe it. You see, up to the very last minute, I thought it was Lawrence. Perrault grinned. I know you did. But John, my old friend John... Every murderer is probably somebody's old friend, observed Perrault philosophically. You cannot mix up sentiment and reason. I must say, I think you might have given me a hint. Perhaps, mon ami, I did not do so, just because he was your old friend. I was rather disconcerted by this, remembering how I had busily passed on to John what I believed to be Perrault's views concerning Bauerstein. He, by the way, had been acquitted of the charge brought against him. Nevertheless, although he had been too clever for them this time, and the charge of espionage could not be brought home to him, his wings were pretty well clipped for the future. I asked Perrault whether he thought John would be condemned. To my intense surprise, he replied that, on the contrary, he was extremely likely to be acquitted. But Perrault, I protested. Oh, my friend, have I not said to you all along that I have no proofs? It is one thing to know that a man is guilty. It is quite another matter to prove him so. And in this case there is terribly little evidence. That is the whole trouble. I, Hercule Poirot, know, but I lack the last link in my chain. And unless I can find that missing link... He shook his head gravely. When did you first suspect John Cavendish? I asked, after a minute or two. Did you not suspect him at all? No, indeed. Not after that fragment of conversation you overheard between Mrs. Cavendish and her mother-in-law, and her subsequent lack of frankness at the inquest. No. Did you not put two and two together and reflect that if it was not Alfred Engelthorpe who was quarreling with his wife, and you remember he strenuously denied it at the inquest, it must be either Lawrence or John? Now, if it was Lawrence, Mary Cavendish's conduct was just as inexplicable. But if, on the other hand, it was John, the whole thing was explained quite naturally. So, I cried, a light breaking in upon me. It was John who quarreled with his mother that afternoon. Exactly. And you have known this all along? Certainly. Mrs. Cavendish's behavior could only be explained that way. And yet you say he may be acquitted? Certainly I do. At the police court proceedings, we shall hear the case for the prosecution, but in all probability, his solicitors will advise him to reserve his defense. That will be sprung upon us at the trial. And, by the way, I have a word of caution to give you, my friend. I must not appear in the case. What? No. Officially, I have nothing to do with it. Until I have found that last link in my chain, I must remain behind the scenes. Mrs. Cavendish must think I am working for her husband, not against him. I say, that's playing it a bit low down, I protested. Not at all. We have to deal with a most clever and unscrupulous man, and we must use any means in our power. Otherwise, he will slip through our fingers. That is why I've been careful to remain in the background. All the discoveries have been made by Jop, and Jop will take all the credit. If I am called upon to give evidence at all, he smiled broadly, it will probably be as a witness for the defense. I could hardly believe my ears. It is quite en règle. I don't actually know how to pronounce that one, continued Perrault. Strangely enough, I can give evidence that will demolish one contention of the prosecution. Which one? The one that relates to the destruction of the will. John Cavendish did not destroy that will. Perrault was a true prophet. I will not go into the details of the police court proceedings. It involves many tiresome repetitions. I will merely state baldly that John Cavendish reserved his defense and was duly committed for trial. Yes, words are quite hard. September found us all in London. Mary took a house in Kensington, Perrault being included in the family party. I myself had been given a job at the War Office, so was able to see them continually. As the weeks went by, the state of Perrault's nerves grew worse and worse. That last link he talked about was still lacking. Privately, I hoped it might remain so. Sorry. For what happiness could there be for Mary if John were not acquitted? On September 15th, John Cavendish appeared in the dock at the Old Bailey, charged with the willful murder of Emily Agnes Engelthorpe, and pleaded not guilty. Sir Ernest Heavyweather, the famous K.C., had been engaged to defend him. Mr. Phillips, K.C., opened the case for the Crown. The murder, he said, was a most premeditated and cold-blooded one. It was neither more nor less than the deliberate poisoning of a fond and trusting woman by the stepson to whom she had been more than a mother. Ever since his boyhood, she had supported him. He and his wife had lived at Styles Court in every luxury, surrounded by her care and attention. She had been their kind and generous benefactress. He proposed to call witnesses to show how the prisoner, a profligate and spendthrift, had been at the end of his financial tether, and had also been carrying on an intrigue with a certain Mrs. Reeks, a neighboring farmer's wife. This having come to his stepmother's ears, she taxed him with it on the afternoon before her death, and a quarrel ensued, part of which was overheard. On the previous day, the prisoner had purchased strychnine at the village chemist's shop, wearing a disguise, by means of which he hoped to throw the onus of the crime upon another man. To wit, Mrs. Engelthorpe's husband, of whom he had been bitterly jealous. Luckily for Mr. Engelthorpe, he had been able to produce an unimpeachable alibi. On the afternoon of July 17th, continued counsel, immediately after the quarrel with her son, Mrs. Engelthorpe made a new will. This will was found destroyed in the grate of her bedroom the following morning, but evidence had come to light which showed that it had been drawn up in favor of her husband. Deceased had already made a will in his favor before her marriage, but, and Mr. Phillips wagged an expressive forefinger, the prisoner was not aware of that. What had induced the deceased to make a fresh will, with the old one still extant, he could not say. She was an old lady, and might possibly have forgotten the former one. Or, this seemed to him more likely, she may have had an idea that it was revoked by her marriage, as there had been some conversation on the subject. Ladies were not always very well versed in legal knowledge. She had, about a year before, executed a will in favor of the prisoner. He would call evidence to show that it was the prisoner who ultimately handed his stepmother her coffee on the fateful night. Later in the evening, he had sought admission to her room, on which occasion, no doubt, he found an opportunity of destroying the will, which, as far as he knew, would render the one in his favor valid. The prisoner had been arrested in consequence of the discovery, in his room, by Detective Inspector Jopp, a most brilliant officer, of the identical phial of strychnine which had been sold at the village chemist's to the supposed Mr. Engelthorpe on the day before the murder. It would be for the jury to decide whether or not these damning facts constituted an overwhelming proof of the prisoner's guilt. And, subtly implying that a jury which did not so decide was quite unthinkable, Mr. Phillips sat down and wiped his forehead. The first witnesses for the prosecution were mostly those who had been called at the inquest, the medical evidence being again taken first. Sir Ernest Heavyweather, who was famous all over England for the unscrupulous manner in which he bullied witnesses, only asked 2 questions. "Hey, Meg, thanks for the lurk. Glad you were here." "I take it, Dr. Bauerstein, that strychnine, as a drug, acts quickly." "Yes." "And that you are unable to account for the delay in this case." "Yes." "Thank you." Mr. Mace identified the file handed him by counsel as that sold by him to Mr. Engelthorpe. Pressed, he admitted that he only knew Mr. Engelthorpe by sight. He had never spoken to him. The witness was not cross-examined. Alfred Engelthorpe was called, and denied having purchased the poison. He also denied having quarreled with his wife. Various witnesses testified to the accuracy of these statements. The gardener's evidence as to the witnessing of the will was taken, and then Dorcas was called. Dorcas, faithful to her young gentleman, denied strenuously that it could have been John's voice she heard, and resolutely declared, in the teeth of everything, that it was Mr. Engelthorpe who had been in the boudoir with her mistress. A rather wistful smile played across the face of the prisoner in the dock. He knew only too well how useless her gallant defiance was, since it was not the object of the defense to deny this point. Mrs. Cavendish, of course, could not be called upon to give evidence against her husband. After various questions on other matters, Mr. Phillips asked, "In the month of June last, do you remember a parcel arriving for Mr. Lawrence Cavendish from Parkson's?" Dorcas shook her head. "I don't remember, sir. It may have done, but Mr. Lawrence was away from home part of June." "In the event of a parcel arriving for him whilst he was away, what would be done with it?" "It would either be put in his room or sent on after him." "By you?" "No, sir. I should leave it on the hall table. It would be Miss Howard who would attend to anything like that." Evelyn Howard was called, and after being examined on other points, was questioned as to the parcel. "Don't remember. Lots of parcels come. Can't remember one special one." "You do not know if it was sent after Mr. Lawrence Cavendish to Wales, or whether it was put in his room?" "Don't think it was sent after him. Should have remembered if it was." "Supposing a parcel arrived addressed to Mr. Lawrence Cavendish, and afterwards it disappeared, should you remark its absence?" "No, don't think so. I should think someone had taken charge of it." "I believe, Miss Howard, that it was you who found this sheet of brown paper." He held up the same dusty piece which Perrault and I had examined in the morning room at Styles. "Yes, I did." "How did you come to look for it?" "The Belgian detective who was employed on the case asked me to search for it." "Where did you eventually discover it?" "On the top of a wardrobe." "On top of the prisoner's wardrobe?" I believe so." Did you not find it yourself? Yes. Then you must know where you found it. Yes, it was on the prisoner's wardrobe. That is better. An assistant from Parkson's theatrical costumers testified that on June 29th, they had supplied a black beard to Mr. L. Cavendish, as requested. It was ordered by letter, and a postal order was enclosed. No, they had not kept the letter. All transactions were entered in their books. They had sent the beard, as directed, to L. Cavendish, Esquire, Styles Court. Sir Ernest Heavyweather rose ponderously. Where was the letter written from? From Styles Court. The same address to which you sent the parcel? Yes. And the letter came from there? Yes. Like a beast of prey, Heavyweather fell upon him. How do you know? I don't understand. How do you know that letter came from Styles? Did you notice the postmark? No, but... Ah, you did not notice the postmark, and yet you affirm so confidently that it came from Styles. It might, in fact, have been any postmark. Yes. In fact, the letter, though written on stamped notepaper, might have been posted from anywhere, from Wales, for instance. The witness admitted that such might be the case, and Sir Ernest signified that he was satisfied. Elizabeth Wells, second housemaid at Styles, stated that after she had gone to bed, she remembered that she had bolted the front door instead of leaving it on the latch as Mr. Engelthorpe had requested. She had accordingly gone downstairs again to rectify her error. Hearing a slight noise in the west wing, she had peeped along the passage, and had seen Mr. John Cavendish knocking at Mrs. Engelthorpe's door. Sir Ernest Heavyweather made short work of her, and under his unmerciful bullying she contradicted herself hopelessly, and Sir Ernest sat down again with a satisfied smile on his face. With the evidence of Annie as to the candle grease on the floor, and as to seeing the prisoner take the coffee into the boudoir, the proceedings were adjourned until the following day. As we went home, Mary Cavendish spoke bitterly against the prosecuting counsel. That hateful man! What a net he has drawn around my poor John! How he twisted every little fact until he made it seem what it wasn't. Well, I said consolingly, it will be the other way about tomorrow. Yes, she said meditatively, then suddenly dropped her voice. Mr. Hastings, you do not think? Surely it could not have been Lawrence. Oh, no, that could not be. But I myself was puzzled, and as soon as I was alone with Perrault, I asked him what he thought Sir Ernest was driving at. Ah, said Perrault appreciatively, he is a clever man, that Sir Ernest. Do you think he believes Lawrence guilty? I do not think he believes or cares anything. No, what he is trying for is to create such confusion in the minds of the jury that they are divided in their opinion as to which brother did it. He is endeavoring to make out that there is quite as much evidence against Lawrence as against John, and I am not at all sure that he will not succeed. Detective Inspector Jopp was the first witness called when the trial was reopened, and he gave his evidence succinctly and briefly. After relating the earlier events, he proceeded. Acting on information received, Superintendent Summerhay and myself searched the prisoner's room during his temporary absence from the house. In his chest of drawers, hidden beneath some underclothing, we found, first, a pair of gold-rimmed pince-nez similar to those worn by Mr. Engelthorpe. These were exhibited. Secondly, this file. The file was that already recognized by the chemist's assistant, a tiny bottle of blue glass containing a few grains of a white crystalline powder and labeled strychnine hydrochloride, poison. A fresh piece of evidence discovered by the detectives since the police court proceedings was a long, almost new piece of blotting paper. It had been found in Mrs. Engelthorpe's checkbook, and on being reversed at a mirror, showed clearly the words, "Everything of which I die possessed, I leave to my beloved husband, Alfred Ing." This placed beyond question the fact that the destroyed will had been in favor of the deceased lady's husband. Jopp then produced the charred fragment of paper recovered from the grate, and this, with the discovery of the beard in the attic, completed his evidence. But Sir Ernest's cross-examination was yet to come. What day was it when you searched the prisoner's room? Tuesday, the 24th of July. Exactly a week after the tragedy? Yes. You found these two objects, you say, in the chest of drawers. Was the drawer unlocked? Yes. Does it not strike you as unlikely that a man who had committed a crime should keep the evidence of it in an unlocked drawer for anyone to find? He might have stowed them there in a hurry. But you have just said it was a whole week since the crime. He would have had ample time to remove them and destroy them. Perhaps. There is no perhaps about it. Would he, or would he not, have had plenty of time to remove and destroy them? Yes. Was the pile of underclothes under which the things were hidden heavy or light? Heavyish. In other words, it was winter underclothing. Obviously, the prisoner would not be likely to go to that drawer. Perhaps not. Kindly answer my question. Would the prisoner, in the hottest week of a hot summer, be likely to go to a drawer containing winter underclothing? Yes or no? No. In that case, is it not possible that the articles in question might have been put there by a third person, and that the prisoner was quite unaware of their presence? I should not think it likely. But it is possible. Yes, that is all. More evidence followed. Evidence as to the financial difficulties in which the prisoner had found himself at the end of July. Evidence as to his intrigue with Mrs. Reeks. Poor Mary, that must have been bitter hearing for a woman of her pride. Evelyn Howard had been right in her facts, though her animosity against Alfred Engelthorpe had caused her to jump to the conclusion that he was the person concerned. Lawrence Cavendish was then put into the box. In a low voice, he answered to Mr. Phillips' questions. He denied having ordered anything from Parkson's in June. In fact, on June 29th, he had been staying away in Wales. Instantly, Sir Ernest's chin was shooting pugnaciously forward. You deny having ordered a black beard from Parkson's on June 29th? I do. Ah, in the event of anything happening to your brother, who will inherit Styles Court? The brutality of the question called a flush to Lawrence's pale face. The judge gave vent to a faint murmur of disapprobation, and the prisoner in the dock leant forward angrily. Heavyweather cared nothing for his client's anger. Answer my question, if you please. I suppose, said Lawrence quietly, that I should. What do you mean by you suppose? Your brother has no children. You would inherit it, wouldn't you? Yes. Ah, that's better, said Heavyweather with ferocious geniality. And you'd inherit a good slice of money, too, wouldn't you? Really, Sir Ernest, protested the judge, these questions are not relevant. Sir Ernest bowed, and having shot his arrow, proceeded. On Tuesday, the 17th July, you went, I believe, with another guest to visit the dispensary at the Red Cross Hospital in Tadminster? Yes. Did you, while you happened to be alone for a few seconds, unlock the poison cupboard and examine some of the bottles? I may have done so. I put it to you that you did do so. Yes. Sir Ernest fairly shot the next question at him. Did you examine one bottle in particular? No, I do not think so. Be careful, Mr. Cavendish. I am referring to a little bottle of hydrochloride of strychnine. Lawrence was turning a sickly greenish color. No, I am sure I didn't. Then how do you account for the fact that you left the unmistakable impress of your fingerprints on it? The bullying manner was highly efficacious with a nervous disposition. I suppose I must have taken up the bottle. I suppose so, too. Did you abstract any of the contents of the bottle? Certainly not. Then why did you take it up? I once studied to be a doctor. Such things naturally interest me. Ah, so poisons naturally interest you, do they? Still, you waited to be alone before gratifying that interest of yours. That was pure chance. If the others had been there, I should have done just the same. Still, as it happens, the others were not there. No, but in fact, during the whole afternoon, you were only alone for a couple of minutes, and it happened, I say it happened, to be during those 2 minutes that you displayed your natural interest in hydrochloride of strychnine. Lawrence stammered pitiably. I, with a satisfied and expressive countenance, Sir Ernest observed, I have nothing more to ask you, Mr. Cavendish. This bit of cross-examination had caused great excitement in court. The heads of the many fashionably attired women present were busily laid together, and their whispers became so loud that the judge angrily threatened to have the court cleared if there was not immediate silence. There was little more evidence. The handwriting experts were called upon for their opinion of the signature of Alfred Engelthorpe in the chemist's poison register. They all declared unanimously that it was certainly not his handwriting, and gave it as their view that it might be that of the prisoner disguised. Cross-examined, they admitted that it might be the prisoner's handwriting cleverly counterfeited. Sir Ernest Heavyweather's speech in opening the case for the defense was not a long one, but it was backed by the full force of his emphatic manner. Never, he said, in the course of his long experience, had he known a charge of murder rest on slighter evidence. Not only was it entirely circumstantial, but the greater part of it was practically unproved. Let them take the testimony they had heard and sift it impartially. The strychnine had been found in a drawer in the prisoner's room. That drawer was an unlocked one, as he had pointed out, and he submitted that there was no evidence to prove that it was the prisoner who had concealed the poison there. It was, in fact, a wicked, malicious attempt on the part of some third person to fix the crime on the prisoner. The prosecution had been unable to produce a shred of evidence in support of their contention that it was the prisoner who ordered the black beard from Parkinson's. The quarrel which had taken place between prisoner and his stepmother was freely admitted, but both it and his financial embarrassments had been grossly exaggerated. His learned friend, Sir Ernest nodded carelessly at Mr. Phillips, had stated if the prisoner were an innocent man, he would have come forward at the inquest to explain it was he, and not Mr. Engelthorpe, who had been the participator in the quarrel. He thought the facts had been misrepresented. What had actually occurred was this. The prisoner, returning to the house on Tuesday evening, had been authoritatively told that there had been a violent quarrel between Mr. and Mrs. Engelthorpe. No suspicion had entered the prisoner's head that anyone could possibly have mistaken his voice for that of Mr. Engelthorpe. He naturally concluded that his stepmother had had 2 quarrels. The prosecution averred that on Monday, July 16th, the prisoner had entered the chemist's shop in the village, disguised as Mr. Engelthorpe. The prisoner, on the contrary, was at that time at a lonely spot called Marston Spinney, where he had been summoned by an anonymous note, couched in blackmailing terms, and threatening to reveal certain matters to his wife unless he complied with its demands. The prisoner had, accordingly, gone to the appointed spot, and after waiting there vainly for half an hour, had returned home. Unfortunately, he had met with no one on the way there or back who could vouch for the truth of his story, but luckily he had kept the note, and it would be produced as evidence. As for the statement relating to the destruction of the will, the prisoner had formerly practiced at the bar, and was perfectly well aware that the will made in his favor a year before was automatically revoked by his stepmother's remarriage. He would call evidence to show who did destroy the will, and that it was possible that that might open up quite a new view of the case. Finally, he would point out to the jury that there was evidence against other people besides John Cavendish. He would direct their attention to the fact that the evidence against Mr. Lawrence Cavendish was quite as strong, if not stronger, than that against his brother. He would now call the prisoner. John acquitted himself well in the witness box. Under Sir Ernest's skillful handling, he told his tale credibly and well. The anonymous note received by him was produced and handed to the jury to examine. The readiness with which he admitted his financial difficulties and the disagreement with his stepmother lent value to his denials. At the close of his examination, he paused and said, "I should like to make one thing clear. I utterly reject and disapprove of Sir Ernest Heavyweather's insinuations against my brother. My brother, I am convinced, had no more to do with the crime than I have." Sir Ernest merely smiled, and noted with a sharp eye that John's protest had produced a very favorable impression on the jury. Then the cross-examination began. "I understand you to say that it never entered your head that the witnesses at the inquest could possibly have mistaken your voice for that of Mr. Engelthorpe. Is that not very surprising?" "No, I don't think so. I was told there had been a quarrel between my mother and Mr. Engelthorpe, and it never occurred to me that such was not really the case." "Not when the servant Dorcas repeated certain fragments of the conversation?" "Fragments which you must have recognized." "I did not recognize them." "Your memory must be unusually short." "No, but we were both angry, and, I think, said more than we meant. I paid very little attention to my mother's actual words." Mr. Phillips' incredulous sniff was a triumph of forensic skill. He passed on to the subject of the note. "You have produced this note very opportunely. Tell me, is there nothing familiar about the handwriting of it?" "Not that I know of." "Do you not think that it bears a marked resemblance to your own handwriting, carelessly disguised?" "No, I do not think so." "I put it to you that it is your own handwriting." "No." "I put it to you that, anxious to prove an alibi, you conceived the idea of a fictitious and rather incredible appointment, and wrote this note yourself in order to bear out your statement." "No." "Is it not a fact that, at the time you claim to have been waiting about at a solitary and unfrequented spot, you were really in the chemist's shop in Style St. Mary, where you purchased strychnine in the name of Alfred Engelthorpe?" "No, that is a lie." "I put it to you that, wearing a suit of Mr. Engelthorpe's clothes, with a black beard trimmed to resemble his, you were there and signed the register in his name." "That is absolutely untrue." "Then I will leave the remarkable similarity of handwriting between the note, the register, and your own to the consideration of the jury," said Mr. Phillips, and sat down with the air of a man who has done his duty, but who is nevertheless horrified by such deliberate perjury. After this, as it was growing late, the case was adjourned till Monday. Poirot, I noticed, was looking profoundly discouraged. He had that little frown between the eyes that I knew so well. "What is it, Poirot?" I inquired. "Ah, mon ami, things are going badly. Badly." In spite of myself, my heart gave a leap of relief. Evidently, there was a likelihood of John Cavendish being acquitted. When we reached the house, my little friend waved aside Mary's offer of tea. "No, I thank you, madame. I will mount to my room." I followed him. Still frowning, he went across to the desk and took out a small pack of patience cards. Then he drew up a chair to the table, and to my utter amazement began solemnly to build card houses. My jaw dropped involuntarily, and he said at once, "No, mon ami, I am not in my second childhood. I steady my nerves, that is all. This employment requires precision of the fingers. With precision of the fingers goes precision of the brain, and never have I needed that more than now." "What is the trouble?" I asked. With a great thump on the table, Poirot demolished his carefully built-up edifice. "It is this, mon ami, that I can build card houses 7 stories high, but I cannot, thump, find, thump, that last link of which I spoke to you." I could not quite tell what to say, so I held my peace, and he began slowly building up the cards again, speaking in jerks as he did so. "It is done, so, by placing one card on another with mathematical precision." I watched the card house rising under his hand, story by story. He never hesitated or faltered. It was really almost like a conjuring trick. "What a steady hand you've got," I remarked. "I believe I've only seen your hand shake once." "On an occasion when I was enraged, without doubt," observed Poirot with great placidity. Yes, indeed. You were in a towering rage. Do you remember? It was when you discovered that the lock of the dispatch case in Mrs. Engelthorpe's bedroom had been forced. You stood by the mantelpiece, twiddling the things on it in your usual fashion, and your hand shook like a leaf. I must say. But I stopped suddenly, for Perrault, uttering a hoarse and inarticulate cry, again annihilated his masterpiece of cards, and putting his hands over his eyes, swayed backwards and forwards, apparently suffering the keenest agony. Good heavens, Perrault, I cried. What is the matter? Are you taken ill? No, no, he gasped. It is that I've had an idea. Oh, I exclaimed, much relieved. One of your little ideas. Ah, ma foi, no, replied Perrault frankly. This time it is an idea gigantic, stupendous, and you, my friend, have given it to me. Suddenly clasping me in his arms, he kissed me warmly on both cheeks, and before I had recovered from my surprise, ran headlong from the room. Mary Cavendish entered at that moment. What is the matter with Monsieur Perrault? He rushed past me, crying out, A garage! For the love of heaven, direct me to a garage, madam. And before I could answer, he had dashed out into the street. I hurried to the window. True enough, there he was, tearing down the street, hatless, and gesticulating as he went. I turned to Mary with a gesture of despair. He'll be stopped by a policeman in another minute. There he goes, round the corner. Our eyes met, and we stared helplessly at one another. What can be the matter? I shook my head. I don't know. He was building card houses, when suddenly he said he had an idea and rushed off as he saw. Well, said Mary, I expect he will be back before dinner. But night fell, and Perrault had not returned. So what do you guys think? Think John did it? Or maybe Lawrence? Anybody feel strongly enough to vote yet? Okay. Well, let's carry on and see what we find out. Chapter 12, The Last Link. Perrault's abrupt departure had intrigued us all greatly. Sunday morning wore away, and still he did not reappear. But about 3 o'clock, a ferocious and prolonged hooting outside drove us to the window, to see Perrault alighting from a car, accompanied by Jop and Summerhay. The little man was transformed. He radiated an absurd complacency. He bowed with exaggerated respect to Mary Cavendish. Madame, I have your permission to hold a little reunion in the salon. It is necessary for everyone to attend. Mary smiled sadly. You know, Monsieur Perrault, that you have carte blanche in every way. You are too amiable, madame. Still beaming, Perrault marshaled us all into the drawing room, bringing forward chairs as he did so. Miss Howard, here. Mademoiselle Cynthia, Monsieur Lawrence, the good Dorcas, and Annie. Bien. We must delay our proceedings a few minutes until Mr. Engelthorpe arrives. I have sent him a note. Miss Howard rose immediately from her seat. If that man comes into the house, I leave it. No, no, Perrault went up to her and pleaded in a low voice. Finally, Miss Howard consented to return to her chair. A few minutes later, Alfred Engelthorpe entered the room. The company, once assembled, Perrault rose from his seat with the air of a popular lecturer, and bowed politely to his audience. Messieurs, mesdames, as you all know, I was called in by Monsieur John Cavendish to investigate this case. I had once examined the bedroom of the deceased, which, by the advice of the doctors, had been kept locked, and was consequently exactly as it had been found when the tragedy occurred. I found, first, a fragment of green material. Second, a stain on the carpet near the window, still damp. Thirdly, an empty box of bromide powders. To take the fragment of green material first, I found it caught in the bolt of the communicating door between that room and the adjoining one occupied by Mademoiselle Cynthia. I handed the fragment over to the police, who did not consider it of much importance. Nor did they recognize it for what it was, a piece torn from a green land armlet. There was a little stir of excitement. Now, there was only one person at Styles who worked on the land, Mrs. Cavendish. Therefore, it must have been Mrs. Cavendish who entered the deceased room through the door communicating with Mademoiselle Cynthia's room. But that door was bolted on the inside, I cried. When I examined the room, yes. But in the first place, we have only her word for it, since it was she who tried that particular door and reported it fastened. In the ensuing confusion, she would have had ample opportunity to shoot the bolt across. I took an early opportunity of verifying my conjectures. To begin with, the fragment corresponds exactly with a tear in Mrs. Cavendish's armlet. Also, at the inquest, Mrs. Cavendish declared that she had heard, from her own room, the fall of the table by the bed. I took an early opportunity of testing that statement by stationing my friend, Monsieur Hastings, in the left wing of the building, just outside Mrs. Cavendish's door. I myself, in company with the police, went to the deceased's room, and whilst there, I, apparently accidentally, knocked over the table in question, but found that, as I had expected, Monsieur Hastings had heard no sound at all. This confirmed my belief that Mrs. Cavendish was not speaking the truth when she declared that she had been dressing in her room at the time of the tragedy. In fact, I was convinced that, far from having been in her own room, Mrs. Cavendish was actually in the deceased's room when the alarm was given. I shot a quick glance at Mary. She was very pale, but smiling. I proceeded to reason on that assumption. Mrs. Cavendish is in her mother-in-law's room. We will say that she is seeking for something and has not yet found it. Suddenly, Mrs. Engelthorpe awakens and is seized with an alarming paroxysm. She flings out her arm, overturning the bed table, and then pulls desperately at the bell. Mrs. Cavendish, startled, drops her candle, scattering the grease on the carpet. She picks it up and retreats quickly to Mademoiselle Cynthia's room, closing the door behind her. She hurries out into the passage, for the servants must not find her where she is. But it is too late. Already footsteps are echoing along the gallery which connects the two wings. What can she do? Quick as thought, she hurries back to the young girl's room and starts shaking her awake. The hastily aroused household comes trooping down the passage. They are all busily battering at Mrs. Engelthorpe's door. It occurs to nobody that Mrs. Cavendish has not arrived with the rest. But, and this is significant, I can find no one who saw her come from the other wing. He looked at Mary Cavendish. Am I right, madame? She bowed her head. Quite right, monsieur. You understand that, if I had thought I would do my husband any good by revealing these facts, I would have done so. But it did not seem to me to bear on the question of his guilt or innocence. In a sense, that is correct, madame, but it cleared my mind of many misconceptions and left me free to see other facts in their true significance. The will, cried Lawrence. Then it was you, Mary, who destroyed the will? She shook her head, and Perrault shook his also. No, he said quietly. There is only one person who could have possibly destroyed that will, Mrs. Engelthorpe herself. Impossible, I exclaimed. She had only made it out that very afternoon. Nevertheless, mon ami, it was Mrs. Engelthorpe, because in no other way can you account for the fact that on one of the hottest days of the year, Mrs. Engelthorpe ordered a fire to be lighted in her room. I gave a gasp. What idiots we had been never to think of that fire as being incongruous. Perrault was continuing. The temperature on that day, messieurs, was 80 degrees in the shade. Yet Mrs. Engelthorpe ordered a fire. Why? Because she wished to destroy something and could think of no other way. You will remember that in consequence of the war economics practiced at Styles, no waste paper was thrown away. There was therefore no means of destroying a thick document such as a will. The moment I heard of a fire being lighted in Mrs. Engelthorpe's room, I leaped to the conclusion that it was to destroy some important document, possibly a will. so the discovery of the charred fragment in the grate was no surprise to me. I did not, of course, know at the time that the will in question had only been made this afternoon, and I will admit that, when I learnt that fact, I fell into a grievous error. I came to the conclusion that Mrs. Engelthorpe's determination to destroy her will arose as a direct consequence of the quarrel she had had that afternoon, and that therefore the quarrel took place after and not before the making of the will. Here, as we know, I was wrong, and I was forced to abandon that idea. I faced the problem from a new standpoint. Now, at 4 o'clock, Dorcas overheard her mistress saying angrily, "You need not think that any fear of publicity or scandal between husband and wife will deter me." I conjectured, and conjectured rightfully, that these words were addressed, not to her husband, but to Mr. John Cavendish. At 5 o'clock, an hour later, she uses almost the same words, but the standpoint is different. She admits to Dorcas, "I don't know what to do. Scandal between husband and wife is a dreadful thing." At 4 o'clock, she has been angry, but completely mistress of herself. Mistress of herself. At 5 o'clock, she is in violent distress, and speaks of having had a great shock. Looking at the matter psychologically, I drew one deduction which I was convinced was correct. The second scandal she spoke of was not the same as the first, and it concerned herself. Let us reconstruct. At 4 o'clock, Mrs. Engelthorpe quarrels with her son and threatens to denounce him to his wife, who, by the way, overheard the greater part of the conversation. At 4:30, Mrs. Engelthorpe, in consequence of conversation on the validity of wills, makes a will in favor of her husband, which the two gardeners witness. At 5 o'clock, Dorcas finds her mistress in a state of considerable agitation, with a slip of paper, a letter, Dorcas thinks, in her hand. It is then that she orders the fire in her room to be lighted. Presumably then, between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, something has occurred to occasion a complete revolution of feeling, since she is now as anxious to destroy the will as she was before to make it. What was that something? As far as we know, she was quite alone during that half hour. Nobody entered or left that boudoir. So what then occasioned this sudden change of sentiment? One can only guess, but I believe my guess to be correct. Mrs. Engelthorpe had no stamps in her desk. We know this because later she asked Dorcas to bring her some. Now in the opposite corner of the room stood her husband's desk, locked. She was anxious to find some stamps, and according to my theory, she tried her own keys in the desk. That one of them fitted, I know. She therefore opened the desk, and in searching for the stamps, she came across something else, that slip of paper which Dorcas saw in her hand, and which assuredly was never meant for Mrs. Engelthorpe's eyes. On the other hand, Mrs. Cavendish believed that the slip of paper to which her mother-in-law clung so tenaciously was a written proof of her own husband's infidelity. She demanded it from Mrs. Engelthorpe, who assured her, quite truly, that it had nothing to do with that matter. Mrs. Cavendish did not believe her. She thought that Mrs. Engelthorpe was shielding her stepson. Now Mrs. Cavendish is a very resolute woman, and behind her mask of reserve, she was madly jealous of her husband. She determined to get hold of that paper at all costs, and in this resolution chance came to her aid. She happened to pick up the key of Mrs. Engelthorpe's dispatch case, which had been lost that morning. She knew that her mother-in-law invariably kept all important papers in this particular case. Mrs. Cavendish, therefore, made her plans as only a woman driven desperate through jealousy could have done. Sometime in the evening she unbolted the door leading into Mademoiselle Cynthia's room. Possibly she applied oil to the hinges, for I found that it opened quite noiselessly when I tried it. She put off her project until the early hours of the morning as being safer, since the servants were accustomed to hearing her move about her room at that time. She dressed completely in her land kit, and made her way quietly through Mademoiselle Cynthia's room into that of Mrs. Engelthorpe. He paused a moment, and Cynthia interrupted. "But I should have woken up if anyone had come through my room." "Not if you were drugged, mademoiselle." "Drugged? Mais oui." "You remember," he addressed us collectively again, that through all the tumult and noise next door, Mademoiselle Cynthia slept. Yep, we knew she was drugged. You're right. That admitted of two possibilities. Either her sleep was feigned, which I did not believe, or her unconsciousness was indeed by artificial means. With this latter idea in my mind, I examined all the coffee cups most carefully, remembering that it was Mrs. Cavendish who had brought Mademoiselle Cynthia her coffee the night before. I took a sample from each cup and had them analyzed, with no result. I had counted the cups carefully in the event of one having been removed. 6 persons had taken coffee, and 6 cups were duly found. I had to confess myself mistaken. Then I discovered that I had been guilty of a very grave oversight. Coffee had been brought in for 7 persons, not 6, for Dr. Bauerstein had been there that evening. That changed the face of the whole affair, for there was now 1 cup missing. The servants noticed nothing, since Annie, the housemaid, who took in the coffee, brought in 7 cups, not knowing that Mr. Engelthorpe never drank it, whereas Dorcas, who cleared them away the following morning, found 6 as usual, where strictly speaking she found 5, the 6th being the one found broken in Mrs. Engelthorpe's room. I was confident that the missing cup was that of Mademoiselle Cynthia. I had an additional reason for that belief in the fact that all the cups found contained sugar, which Mademoiselle Cynthia never took in her coffee. My attention was attracted by the story of Annie about some salt on the tray of cocoa, which she took every night to Mrs. Engelthorpe's room. I accordingly secured a sample of that cocoa and sent it to be analyzed. Just a second. Sorry about that. I had to cough. Didn't figure you guys wanted to hear that. But that had already been done by Dr. Bauerstein, said Lawrence quickly. Not exactly. The analyst was asked by him to report whether strychnine was or was not present. He did not have it tested, as I did, for a narcotic. For a narcotic? Yes. Here is the analyst's report. Mrs. Cavendish administered a safe but effectual narcotic to both Mrs. Engelthorpe and Mademoiselle Cynthia. And it is possible that she had a... Alright, may as well get that words are hard out ready, but... And it is possible that she had a mauvaise quart d'heure in consequence. Imagine her feelings when her mother-in-law is suddenly taken ill and dies, and immediately afterwards she hears the word poison. She has believed that the sleeping draught she administered was perfectly harmless, but there is no doubt that for one terrible moment she must have feared that Mrs. Engelthorpe's death lay at her door. She is seized with panic, and under its influence she hurries downstairs and quickly drops the coffee cup and saucer used by Mademoiselle Cynthia into a large brass vase, where it is discovered later by Monsieur Lawrence. The remains of the cocoa she dare not touch. Too many eyes are upon her. Guess at her relief when strychnine is mentioned, and she discovers that after all, the tragedy is not her doing. We are now able to account for the symptoms of strychnine poisoning being so long in making their appearance. A narcotic taken with strychnine will delay the action of poison for some hours. Perrault paused. Mary looked up at him, the color slowly rising in her face. All you have said is quite true, Monsieur Perrault. It was the most awful hour of my life. I shall never forget it. But you are wonderful. I understand now. What I meant when I told you that you could safely confess to Papa Perrault, eh? But you would not trust me. I see everything now, said Lawrence. The drugged cocoa, taken on top of the poisoned coffee, amply accounts for the delay. Exactly. But was the coffee poisoned, or was it not? We come to a little difficulty here, since Mrs. Engelthorpe never drank it. What? The cry of surprise was universal. No. You will remember my speaking of a stain on the carpet in Mrs. Engelthorpe's room. There were some peculiar points about that stain. It was still damp. It exhaled a strong odor of coffee, and embedded in the nap of the carpet I found some little splinters of china. What had happened was plain to me, for not 2 minutes before I had placed my little case on the table near the window, and the table, tilting up, had deposited it upon the floor on precisely the identical spot. In exactly the same way, Mrs. Engelthorpe had laid down her cup of coffee on reaching her room the night before, and the treacherous table had played her the same trick. What happened next is mere guesswork on my part, but I should say that Mrs. Engelthorpe picked up the broken cup and placed it on the table by the bed. Feeling in need of a stimulant of some kind, she heated up her cocoa and drank it off then and there. Now, we are faced with a new problem. We know the cocoa contained no strychnine. The coffee was never drunk, yet the strychnine must have been administered between 7 and 9 o'clock that evening. What third medium was there? A medium so suitable for disguising the taste of strychnine that it is extraordinary no one has thought of it. Poirot looked round the room, and then answered himself impressively. Her medicine! Do you mean that the murderer introduced the strychnine into her tonic? There was no need to introduce it. It was already there, in the mixture. The strychnine that killed Mrs. Engelthorpe was the identical strychnine prescribed by Dr. Wilkins. To make that clear to you, I will read you an extract from a book on dispensing, which I found in the dispensary of the Red Cross Hospital at Tadminster. The following prescription has become famous in textbooks. Strychnine sulfochloride, 1 gram. Potassium bromide, 3.6. Aquaad, 3.8. Fiat mistura. This solution deposits in a few hours the greater part of the strychnine salt as an insoluble bromide in transparent crystals. A lady in England lost her life by taking a similar mixture. The precipitated strychnine collected at the bottom, and in taking the last dose, she swallowed nearly all of it. Now there was, of course, no bromide in Dr. Wilkins' prescription, but you will remember that I mentioned an empty box of bromide powders. 1 or 2 of those powders, introduced into the full bottle of medicine, would effectually precipitate the strychnine, as the book describes, and cause it to be taken in the last dose. You will learn later that the person who usually poured out Mrs. Engelthorpe's medicine was always extremely careful not to shake the bottle, but to leave the sediment at the bottom of it undisturbed. Throughout the case, there have been evidences that the tragedy was intended to take place on Monday evening. On that day, Mrs. Engelthorpe's bell wire was neatly cut, and on Monday evening, Mademoiselle Cynthia was spending the night with friends, so that Mrs. Engelthorpe would have been quite alone in the right wing, completely shut off from help of any kind, and would have died, in all probability, before medical aid could have been summoned. But in her hurry to be in time for the village entertainment, Mrs. Engelthorpe forgot to take her medicine, and the next day she lunched away from home, so that the last and fatal dose was actually taken 24 hours later than had been anticipated by the murderer, and it is owing to that delay that the final proof, the last link of the chain, is now in my hands. Amid breathless excitement, he held out 3 thin strips of paper. A letter in the murderer's own handwriting, mes amis. Had it been a little clearer in its terms, it is possible that Mrs. Engelthorpe, warned in time, would have escaped. As it was, she realized her danger, but not the manner of it. In the deathly silence, Poirot pieced together the slips of paper, and clearing his throat, read, "Dearest Evelyn, you will be anxious at hearing nothing. It is all right, only it will be tonight instead of last night. You understand. There's a good time coming once the old woman is dead and out of the way. No one can possibly bring home the crime to me. That idea of yours about the bromides was a stroke of genius, but we must be very circumspect. A false step. Here, my friends, the letter breaks off. Doubtless the writer was interrupted, but there can be no question as to his identity. We all know this handwriting, and a howl that was almost a scream broke the silence. You devil! How did you get it? A chair was overturned. Poirot skipped nimbly aside. A quick movement on his part, and his assailant fell with a crash. Messieurs, mesdames, said Poirot with a flourish, let me introduce you to the murderer, Mr. Alfred Engelthorpe. Well, I think we have it. Chapter 13. Poirot explains. Poirot, you old villain, I said. I've half a mind to strangle you. What do you mean by deceiving me as you have done? Wait, what? Evie, yeah? What about her? Yes, they are. Evie is Evelyn, the one he was writing to in that note. The one who had the idea about the bromides. Just a term of endearment, a little old-fashioned. It doesn't mean anything sketchy, if that's what you're thinking. If you remember, Poirot was saying that her passionate hatred seemed feigned and fake. Yeah, she doesn't actually hate him. It was to throw off anybody thinking they were working together. Yes. Murderous bastards, no less. Poirot, you old villain, I said. I've half a mind to strangle you. What do you mean by deceiving me as you have done? We were sitting in the library. Several hectic days lay behind us. In the room below, John and Mary were together once more, while Alfred Engelthorpe and Miss Howard were in custody. Now at last I had Poirot to myself, and I could reveal... I suppose it is intermission time. You're right. It's a good stopping point. We'll do intermission. My bad. Oh, I think this might be the last chapter. So, after the chapter, or at least after the story is done, would anyone like to play some Among Us or something like that? Stretch it out. Oh, I should stretch. Yeah, I did stretch. You sure that webcam's not on me instead of the Sisyphus? Are you watching me? It's not nice to spy. My teacup is half full. It's just fine. It's even still warm. I mean, not completely warm, but not cold yet either. So, what do you think? Should we read some more murder mysteries? Or should we pick something entirely different? You want another mystery? Okay. So, I confess, I already knew the identity of the murderer. But not because I was reading ahead or cheating or anything. Somebody on Reddit decided to private message me off of one of the posts about reading Agatha Christie. And the guy's Reddit name was actually Ruins It For You. Is literally his name. And yeah. Gave me a massive spoiler. Total dick. Hey, Panda. Yeah, I was not very happy with that guy. That was a really, really awful thing to do. I had even, specifically, when I was discussing it with people, said that I hadn't read it yet, and that we were, doing polls and trying to figure out who did it and all that, and asking people not to spoil it. So, of course, people on the internet, being people on the internet, should have predicted that. Oh well. So I've been trying to keep my mouth shut on the killer's identity since it got ruined for me, so that it wouldn't get ruined for all of you. I admit I was not entirely certain when he spoiled it for me if he was just messing with me or if he was being honest, because at that point in the story it was not clear that Alfred and Evelyn were conspiring together. It was distinctly possible, but not totally clear. Pleasure at ruining something for someone else? Oh, Alfred and Evie? Alfred doesn't have to cater to Emily anymore and wait on her. No, he would have gotten the house. Because of the will and all that. When they talked about John getting the house, that was if Alfred had been convicted of the murder. I don't know if that's true. But it also kind of seemed like they tried to pin it on him. So if John went to jail for the murder, but I don't know. I'm guessing that we're about to find out, though. So let's head back to the story and let Monsieur Perrault sum it up for us, shall we? Also, for any of you watching who have not taken the opportunity to follow yet, please, if you're enjoying the stream, scroll down, click that purple follow button. As you see, we're trying to get to 50 follows by the end of the month. We're almost there. We're very close. It'd be really cool if we could hit 50 by the end of my first month streaming. But I also have a YouTube and a Discord available. Please do join the Discord. Get a chance to talk to other people in the bedtime community, play games together, that sort of thing, talk about the books that we read, request additional ones, and give feedback on the stream. The YouTube has the archive of all of my past streams, and so anything that you may have missed, or if you want to go back to later, you can find on the YouTube. And please like, follow, subscribe, all that stuff. So, back to the story. Chapter 13. Poirot explains. "Poirot, you old villain," I said. "I've half a mind to strangle you. What do you mean by deceiving me as you have done?" We were sitting in the library. Several hectic days lay behind us. In the room below, John and Mary were together once more, while Alfred Engelthorpe and Miss Howard were in custody. Now at last I had Poirot to myself, and could relieve my still burning curiosity. Poirot did not answer me for a moment, but at last he said, "I did not deceive you, mon ami. At most, I permitted you to deceive yourself." "Yes, but why?" "Well, it is difficult to explain. You see, my friend, you have a nature so honest and a countenance so transparent that, in fine, to conceal your feelings is impossible. If I had told you my ideas, the very first time you saw Mr. Alfred Engelthorpe, that astute gentleman would have, in your so expressive idiom, smelt a rat, and then bonjour to our chances of catching him. I think that I have more diplomacy than you give me credit for." "My friend," besought Poirot, "I implore you, do not enrage yourself. Your help has been of the most invaluable. It is but the extremely beautiful nature that you have which made me pause." "Well," I grumbled, a little mollified, "I still think you might have given me a hint." "But I did, my friend. Several hints. You would not take them. Think now, did I ever say to you that I believed John Cavendish guilty? Did I not, on the contrary, tell you that he would almost certainly be acquitted? Yes, but... And did I not immediately afterwards speak of the difficulty of bringing the murderer to justice? Was it not plain to you that I was speaking of two entirely different persons?" "No," I said, "it was not plain to me." Then again continued Poirot, "At the beginning, did I not repeat to you several times that I didn't want Mr. Engelthorpe arrested now? That should have conveyed something to you." "Do you mean to say that you suspected him as long ago as that?" "Yes. To begin with, whoever else might benefit by Mrs. Engelthorpe's death, her husband would benefit the most. There was no getting away from that. When I went up to Styles with you that first day, I had no idea as to how the crime had been committed, but from what I knew of Mr. Engelthorpe, I fancied that it would be very hard to find anything to connect him with it. When I arrived at the chateau, I realized at once that it was Mrs. Engelthorpe who had burnt the will. And there, by the way, you cannot complain, my friend, for I tried my best to force on you the significance of that bedroom fire in midsummer." Yes, I said impatiently. "Go on." "Well, my friend, as I say, my views as to Mr. Engelthorpe's guilt were very much shaken. There was, in fact, so much evidence against him that I was inclined to believe that he had not done it." "When did you change your mind?" "When I found that the more efforts I made to clear him, the more efforts he made to get himself arrested. Then, when I discovered that Engelthorpe had nothing to do with Mrs. Reeks, and that in fact it was John Cavendish who was interested in that quarter, I was quite sure." "But why?" "Simply this. If it had been Engelthorpe who was carrying on an intrigue with Mrs. Reeks, his silence was perfectly comprehensible. But when I discovered that it was known all over the village that it was John who was attracted by the farmer's pretty wife, his silence bore quite a different interpretation. It was nonsense to pretend he was afraid of the scandal, as no possible scandal could attach to him. This attitude of his gave me furiously to think, and I was slowly forced to the conclusion that Alfred Engelthorpe wanted to be arrested. Eh bien, from that moment I was equally determined that he should not be arrested." "Wait a minute. I don't see why he wished to be arrested. Because, mon ami, it is the law of your country that a man, once acquitted, can never be tried again for the same offense. Aha! But it was clever, his idea. Assuredly he is a man of method. See here, he knew that in his position he was bound to be suspected. So he conceived the exceedingly clever idea of preparing a lot of manufactured evidence against himself. He wished to be arrested. He would then produce his irreproachable alibi, and hey presto, he was safe for life. But I still don't see how he managed to prove his alibi and yet go to the chemist shop. Poirot stared at me in surprise. Is it possible? My poor friend, you have not yet realized that it was Miss Howard who went to the chemist shop. Miss Howard? But certainly. Who else? It was most easy for her. She's of good height. Her voice is deep and manly. Moreover, remember, she and Engelthorpe are cousins, and there is a distinct resemblance between them, especially in their gait and bearing. It was simplicity itself. They are a clever pair. I'm still a little fogged as to how exactly the bromide business was done, I remarked. Bon, I will reconstruct for you as far as possible. I am inclined to think that Miss Howard was the mastermind in that affair. You remember her once mentioning that her father was a doctor. Possibly she dispensed his medicines for him, or she may have taken the idea from one of the many books lying about when Mademoiselle Cynthia was studying for her exam. Anyway, she was familiar with the fact that the addition of a bromide to a mixture containing strychnine would cause the precipitation of the latter. Probably the idea came to her quite suddenly. Mrs. Engelthorpe had a box of bromide powders, which she occasionally took at night. What could be easier than quietly to dissolve one or more of those powders in Mrs. Engelthorpe's large-sized bottle of medicine when it came from Coots? The risk is practically nil. The tragedy will not take place until nearly a fortnight later. If anyone has seen either of them touching the medicine, they will have forgotten it by that time. Miss Howard will have engineered her quarrel and departed from the house. The lapse of time and her absence will defeat all suspicion. Yes, it was a clever idea. If they had left it alone, it is possible that the crime might have never been brought home to them. But they were not satisfied. They tried to be too clever, and that was their undoing. Poirot puffed at his tiny cigarette, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. They arranged a plan to throw suspicion on John Cavendish by buying strychnine at the village chemist's and signing the register in his handwriting. On Monday, Mrs. Engelthorpe will take the last dose of her medicine. On Monday, therefore, at 6 o'clock, Alfred Engelthorpe arranges to be seen by a number of people at a spot far removed from the village. Miss Howard had previously made up a cock-and-bull story about him and Mrs. Reeks to account for his holding his tongue afterwards. At 6 o'clock, Miss Howard, disguised as Alfred Engelthorpe, enters the chemist's shop with her story about a dog, obtains the strychnine, and writes the name of Alfred Engelthorpe in John's handwriting, which she had previously studied carefully. But, as it will never do if John, too, can prove an alibi, she writes him an anonymous note, still copying his handwriting, which takes him to a remote spot where it is exceedingly unlikely that anyone will see him. So far, all goes well. Miss Howard goes back to Middlingham. Alfred Engelthorpe returns to Styles. There is nothing that can compromise him in any way, since it is Miss Howard who has the strychnine, which, after all, is only wanted as a blind to throw suspicion on John Cavendish. But now a hitch occurs. Mrs. Engelthorpe does not take her medicine that night. The broken bell, Cynthia's absence, arranged by Engelthorpe through his wife, all these are wasted. And then he makes his slip. Mrs. Engelthorpe is out, and he sits down to write to his accomplice, who, he fears, may be in a panic at the non-success of their plan. It is probable that Mrs. Engelthorpe returned earlier than he expected. Caught in the act, and somewhat flurried, he hastily shuts and locks his desk. He fears that if he remains in the room, he may have to open it again, and that Mrs. Engelthorpe might catch sight of the letter before he could snatch it up. So he goes out and walks in the woods, little dreaming that Mrs. Engelthorpe will open his desk and discover the incriminating document. But this, as we know, is what happened. Mrs. Engelthorpe reads it and becomes aware of the perfidy of her husband and Evelyn Howard, though unfortunately the sentence about the bromides conveys no warning to her mind. She knows that she is in danger, but is ignorant of where the danger lies. She decides to say nothing to her husband, but sits down and writes to her solicitor, asking him to come on the morrow, and she also determines to destroy immediately the will which she has just made. She keeps the fatal letter. It was to discover that letter, then, that her husband forced the lock of the dispatch case. Yes, and from the enormous risk he ran, we can see how fully he realized its importance. That letter accepted, there was absolutely nothing to connect him with the crime. There's only one thing I can't make out. Why didn't he destroy it at once when he got hold of it? Because he did not dare take the biggest risk of all, that of keeping it on his own person. I don't understand. Look at it from his point of view. I have discovered that there were only 5 short minutes in which he could have taken it, the 5 minutes immediately before our own arrival on the scene, for before that time Annie was brushing the stairs and would have seen anyone who passed going to the right wing. Figure to yourself the scene. He enters the room, unlocking the door by means of one of the other door keys. They were all much alike. He hurries to the dispatch case. It is locked, and the keys are nowhere to be seen. That is a terrible blow to him, for it means that his presence in the room cannot be concealed as he had hoped. But he sees clearly that everything must be risked for the sake of that damning piece of evidence. Quickly, he forces the lock with a penknife, and turns over the papers until he finds what he is looking for. But now a fresh dilemma arises. He dare not keep that piece of paper on him. He may be seen leaving the room. He may be searched. If the paper is found on him, it is certain doom. Probably, at this minute too, he hears the sounds below of Mr. Wells and John leaving the boudoir. He must act quickly. Where can he hide this terrible slip of paper? The contents of the wastepaper basket are kept, and in any case are sure to be examined. There are no means of destroying it, and he dare not keep it. He looks round, and he sees. What do you think, mon ami? I shook my head. In a moment he has torn the letter into long, thin strips, and rolling them up into spills, he thrusts them hurriedly in amongst the other spills in the vase on the mantelpiece. I uttered an exclamation. No one would think of looking there, Poirot continued, and he will be able, at his leisure, to come back and destroy this solitary piece of evidence against him. Then, all this time, it was in the spill vase in Mrs. Engelthorpe's bedroom, under our very noses, I cried. Poirot nodded. Yes, my friend, that is where I discovered my last link, and I owe that very fortunate discovery to you. To me? Yes. Do you remember me telling me that my hand shook as I was straightening the ornaments on the mantelpiece? Yes, but I don't see. No, but I saw. Do you know, my friend, I remember that earlier in the morning, when we had been there together, I had straightened all the objects on the mantelpiece. And if they were already straightened, there would be no need to straighten them again, unless, in the meantime, someone else had touched them. Dear me, I murmured. So that is the explanation of your extraordinary behavior. You rushed down to Styles and found it still there. Yes, and it was a race for time. But I still can't understand why Engelthorpe was such a fool as to leave it there when he had plenty of opportunity to destroy it. Ah, but he had no opportunity. I saw to that. You? Yes. Do you remember reproving me for taking the household into my confidence on the subject? Yes. Well, my friend, I saw there was just one chance. I was not sure then if Engelthorpe was the criminal or not. But if he was, I reasoned that he would not have the paper on him, but would have hidden it somewhere, and by enlisting the sympathy of the household, I could effectually prevent his destroying it. He was already under suspicion, and by making the matter public, I secured the services of about 10 amateur detectives who would be watching him unceasingly, and being himself aware of their watchfulness, he would not dare seek further to destroy the document. He was therefore forced to depart from the house, leaving it in the spill vase. But surely Miss Howard had ample opportunities of aiding him. Yes, but Miss Howard did not know of the paper's existence. In accordance with their prearranged plan, she never spoke to Alfred Engelthorpe. They were supposed to be deadly enemies, and until John Cavendish was safely convicted, they neither of them dared risk a meeting. Of course, I had a watch kept on Mr. Engelthorpe, hoping that sooner or later he would lead me to the hiding place. But he was too clever to take any chances. The paper was safe where it was. Since no one had thought of looking there in the first week, it was not likely they would do so afterwards. But for your lucky remark, we might never have been able to bring him to justice. I understand that now, but when did you first begin to suspect Miss Howard? When I discovered that she had told a lie at the inquest about the letter she had received from Mrs. Engelthorpe. Why? What was there to lie about? You saw that letter. Do you recall its general appearance? Yes, more or less. You will recollect, then, that Mrs. Engelthorpe wrote a very distinctive hand and left large clear spaces between her words. But if you look at the date on the top of the letter, you will notice that July 17th is quite different in this respect. Do you see what I mean? No, I confessed. I don't. You do not see that the letter was not written on the 17th, but on the 7th, the day after Miss Howard's departure. The 1 was written in before the 7 to turn it into the 17th. That is exactly what I asked myself. Why does Miss Howard suppress the letter written on the 17th and produce this faked one instead? Because she did not wish to show the letter of the 17th. Why again? And at once a suspicion dawned in my mind. You will remember my saying that it was wise to beware of people who were not telling you the truth. And yet, I cried indignantly, after that, you gave me 2 reasons why Miss Howard could not have committed the crime. And very good reasons, too, replied Poirot. For a long time they were a stumbling block to me, until I remembered a very significant fact, that she and Alfred Engelthorpe were cousins. She could not have committed the crime single-handed, but the reasons against that did not debar her from being an accomplice. And then there was that rather over-vehement hatred of hers. It concealed a very opposite emotion. There was, undoubtedly, a tie of passion between them long before he came to Styles. They had already arranged their infamous plot, that he should marry this rich but rather foolish old lady, induce her to make a will leaving her money to him, and then gain their ends by a very cleverly concealed crime. If all had gone as they planned, they would probably have left England and lived together on their poor victim's money. Well, I might have been wrong about the dearest. They are a very astute and unscrupulous pair. While suspicion was to be directed against him, she would be making quiet preparations for a very different denouement. She arrives from Middlingham with all the compromising items in her possession. No suspicion attaches to her. No notice is paid to her coming and going in the house. She hides the strychnine and glasses in John's room. She puts the beard in the attic. She will see to it that sooner or later they are duly discovered. I don't quite see why they tried to fix the blame on John, I remarked. It would have been much easier for them to bring the crime home to Lawrence. Yes, but that was mere chance. All the evidence against him arose out of pure accident, and must, in fact, have been distinctly annoying to the pair of schemers. His manner was unfortunate, I observed thoughtfully. Yes, you realize, of course, what was at the back of that. No? You did not understand that he believed Mademoiselle Cynthia guilty of the crime. No, I exclaimed, astonished. Impossible. Not at all. I myself nearly had the same idea. It was in my mind when I asked Mr. Wells that first question about the will. Then there were the bromide powders which she had made up, and her clever male impersonations, as Dorcas recounted them to us. There was really more evidence against her than anyone else. You're joking, Poirot. No. Shall I tell you what made Monsieur Lawrence turn so pale when he first entered his mother's room on that fateful night? It was because, whilst his mother lay there, obviously poisoned, he saw, over your shoulder, that the door into Mademoiselle Cynthia's room was unbolted. But he declared that he saw it bolted, I cried. Exactly, said Poirot dryly. And that was just what confirmed my suspicion that it was not. He was shielding Mademoiselle Cynthia. But why should he shield her? Because he is in love with her. I laughed. There, Perrault, you are quite wrong. I happen to know for a fact that, far from being in love with her, he positively dislikes her. Who told you that, mon ami? Cynthia herself. La pauvre petite, and she was concerned. She said that she did not mind at all. Then she certainly did mind very much, remarked Perrault. They are like that, les femmes. What you say about Lawrence is a great surprise to me, I said. But why? It was most obvious. Did not Monsieur Lawrence make the sour face every time Mademoiselle spoke and laughed with his brother? He had taken it into his long head that Mademoiselle Cynthia was in love with Monsieur John. When he entered his mother's room and saw her obviously poisoned, he jumped to the conclusion that Mademoiselle Cynthia knew something about the matter. He was nearly driven desperate. First, he crushed the coffee cup to powder under his feet, remembering that she had gone up with his mother the night before, and he determined there should be no chance of testing its contents. Thenceforward, he strenuously and quite uselessly upheld the theory of death from natural causes. And what about the extra coffee cup? I was fairly certain that it was Mrs. Cavendish who had hidden it, but I had to make sure. Monsieur Lawrence did not know at all what I meant, but on reflection, he came to the conclusion that if he could find an extra coffee cup anywhere, his ladylove would be cleared of suspicion. And he was perfectly right. One thing more. What did Mrs. Engelthorpe mean by her dying words? They were, of course, an accusation against her husband. Dear me, Perrault, I said with a sigh. I think you have explained everything. I am glad it has all ended so happily. Even John and his wife are reconciled. Thanks to me. How do you mean, thanks to you? My dear friend, do you not realize that it was simply and solely the trial which has brought them together again? That John Cavendish still loved his wife, I was convinced. Also, that she was equally in love with him, but they had drifted very far apart. It all arose from a misunderstanding. She married him without love. He knew it. He is a sensitive man in his way. He would not force himself upon her if she did not want him. And as he withdrew, her love awoke. But they are both unusually proud, and their pride held them inexorably apart. He drifted into an entanglement with Mrs. Reeks, and she deliberately cultivated the friendship of Dr. Bauerstein. Do you remember the day of John Cavendish's arrest, when you found me deliberating over a big decision? Yes, I quite understood your distress. Pardon me, mon ami, but you did not understand it in the least. I was trying to decide whether or not I would clear John Cavendish at once. I could have cleared him, though it might have meant a failure to convict the real criminals. They were entirely in the dark as to my real attitude up to the very last moment, which partly accounts for my success. Do you mean that you could have saved John Cavendish from being brought to trial? Yes, my friend, but I eventually decided in favor of a woman's happiness. Nothing but the great danger through which they had passed could have brought these two proud souls together again. I looked at Perrault in silent amazement. The colossal cheek of the little man. Who on earth but Perrault would have thought of a trial for murder as a restorer of conjugal happiness? I perceive your thoughts, mon ami, said Perrault, smiling at me. No one but Hercule Poirot would have attempted such a thing, and you are wrong in condemning it. The happiness of one man and one woman is the greatest thing in all the world. His words took me back to earlier events. I remembered Mary as she lay white and exhausted on the sofa, listening and listening. There had come the sound of the bell below. She had started up. Perrault had opened the door, and meeting her agonized eyes, had nodded gently. Yeah, he is. Yes, madame, he said. I have brought him back to you. He had stood aside, and as I went out, I had seen the look in Mary's eyes, as John Cavendish had caught his wife in his arms. Perhaps you are right, Perrault, I said gently. Yes, it is the greatest thing in the world. Suddenly, there was a tap at the door, and Cynthia peeped in. I only... Come in, I said, springing up. She came in, but did not sit down. I only wanted to tell you something. Yes? Cynthia fidgeted with a little tassel for some moments, then suddenly exclaiming, "You dears!" kissed first me and then Perrault, and rushed out of the room again. "What on earth does this mean?" I asked, surprised. It was very nice to be kissed by Cynthia, but the publicity of the salute rather impaired the pleasure. "It means that she has discovered Monsieur Lawrence does not dislike her as much as she thought," replied Perrault philosophically. "But here he is." Lawrence at that moment passed through the door. "Eh, Monsieur Lawrence," called Perrault. "We must congratulate you, is it not so?" Lawrence blushed, and then smiled awkwardly. A man in love is a sorry spectacle. Now Cynthia had looked charming. I sighed. "What is it, mon ami?" "Nothing," I said sadly. "They are two delightful women." "And neither of them is for you," finished Perrault. "Never mind. Console yourself, my friend. We may hunt together again. Who knows? And then..." The end. Oh, that was a good story. I'd never actually read through one of Agatha Christie's books before. This was my first time actually reading one of hers. I'd seen like the occasional film made from one of her works, but only in passing, and I was really too young to appreciate it. I was more irritated that my grandparents weren't putting on cartoons rather than interested in watching the movie. But this was nice. Hey, Sparky. Thanks for showing up, and thank you for the follow the other day. I think I'll pass on the Westerns. There's really only three Westerns that I've enjoyed. Star Wars, Firefly, and Rooster Cockburn. Star Wars is totally a Western. Although I suppose at this point it's quite a few movies. I may be a dork, but that's neither here nor there, and it has nothing to do with the fact that there's only a couple of Westerns that I like. So, calling me a dork. All right. Well, in any case, I'll see if there's any other Storytime streamers on, but I doubt there are any streaming at this time slot. Nope, there are not. I mean, okay, there may be some good Westerns if you're judging them against Westerns, but that also doesn't mean that I think they're good. So I'll pass. It's just not my thing. So it doesn't look like there's any Storytime streamers going. But if anybody wants to play a couple quick Among Us matches, we could pop into the Discord. And if we can get enough people, we can run some real quick. Anybody interested? And I'll go ahead and pop into the gaming channel on the Discord. All right, I'm in the gaming channel. Anybody who's interested in playing some Among Us can join me in there. And there's the Discord link right there in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. If we get one going, I might start a Among Us stream, though. All right. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Please do follow if you haven't already. I'm glad you were able to join me for the Mysterious Ferret Styles. Let's get a couple of requests in the book request, and we'll figure out what we're going to read for this time slot next week. might pick up another Agatha Christie, might do something entirely different. Let's talk about it. So please jump in, join the Discord, play some games with us, discuss the books and stories, post some pictures of your fluffy friends. There's quite a bunch of cute photos in that channel already. And thank you for joining me for bedtime. All right. Good night.